$5,500. That's what the HOA eventually fined me for snow. Snow they dumped on my property themselves. But the part that still sticks with me didn't start with the fine. It started at 6:47 a.m. with a sound that ripped me straight out of sleep. Metal scraping asphalt. At first it was faint, then louder, then constant. If you've ever heard a snowplow blade grinding across frozen pavement, you know that sound. It's sharp, metallic, almost violent. It echoes through quiet winter mornings like someone dragging a steel shovel across a concrete floor. I rolled over, half awake, expecting to see the usual thing when I looked outside, just the HOA clearing the neighborhood streets. Instead, when I pulled back the curtain, I saw something that made my stomach drop. 4 snowplow trucks were parked right at the edge of my property, not clearing the road. Dumping, one after another, the trucks lifted their beds and unloaded massive piles of snow directly onto my land, mountains of it. Dirty snow mixed with sand, salt, gravel, and chunks of ice the size of bowling balls came crashing down into my yard. The first truck dumped its load, then the second, then the third, then the fourth. And just like that, 3 weeks of winter buildup from the entire neighborhood was sitting on my property, right across my driveway, blocking it completely. For a second I just stood there, staring through the window, trying to convince myself I was misunderstanding what I was seeing. Maybe they were just moving snow temporarily. Maybe they'd come back later and haul it away. But then one of the drivers looked up and saw me watching, and instead of looking surprised, he shrugged. Actually shrugged, like this was normal. Like dumping half the neighborhood's snow onto my property was somehow doing me a favor. I threw on my boots and jacket and stepped outside. The cold air hit my face like a slap. Diesel engines rumbled loudly as the trucks idled, thick exhaust hanging in the frozen air. I could smell the sharp chemical bite of road salt mixed with dirty snow. "Hey!" I shouted, walking toward them. "What the hell are you doing?" The lead driver leaned out his window, completely relaxed. "Clearing the streets," he said. "Yeah, I can see that," I replied, pointing at the massive snow pile forming in my yard. "Why are you dumping it here?" He gave me another casual shrug. "Where else are we supposed to put it?" And that was the moment I realized something important. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't some confused plow driver picking the wrong spot. This was policy. The HOA had decided my property was the neighborhood snow dump. Truck number 5 pulled up behind the others. Its hydraulic lift groaned as the bed slowly tilted upward. Another avalanche of snow slid down the metal bed and crashed onto the growing pile in my yard. My driveway disappeared completely. My mailbox vanished. Even part of the front lawn was buried under a filthy mountain of snow and ice, and the trucks just kept coming. I stood there in the freezing morning air, watching my property slowly disappear under the neighborhood's winter garbage. That's when I noticed something else. One of the drivers wasn't even pretending to hide it. He was smiling. Like this whole thing was funny. Like I was just another homeowner they could walk all over. What they didn't realize was that by the time winter ended, that exact pile of snow was going to become the biggest mistake the HOA had ever made. Storytime, $500. That's the number printed at the top of the letter sitting under my windshield wiper. Not an apology, not an explanation. A fine. For a moment I honestly thought it was some kind of mistake. Maybe the HOA office didn't know their snowplows had been dumping the entire neighborhood's snow onto my property for the past 3 days. But the moment I opened the envelope, I realized something. This wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. The paper had the official HOA logo printed across the top in bold blue ink, followed by the words that made my blood start to boil. Violation notice. Snow accumulation creating hazardous conditions. I read the next line twice just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. $500 fine. Reason. Snow accumulation blocking street access and creating a safety hazard. Snow. The same snow their trucks had dumped into my yard every morning since the storm. My driveway was still completely buried under a frozen mountain of dirty ice, road salt, and sand scraped from every street in the neighborhood. And now they were fining me for it. I crumpled the letter slightly in my hand, feeling the thick, expensive paper crease between my fingers. Inside the house, Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through medical bills. The morning light coming through the window made her look even paler than usual. Chemo had taken a lot out of her the past few months. She glanced up when I walked in. "What's wrong?" I dropped the letter on the table in front of her. "These people just fined us $500, I said. "For what?" "For snow." She looked confused. "What snow?" "The snow they dumped on our property." She stared at me for a moment, trying to process that sentence. Then she slowly picked up the letter and started reading. Her eyebrows lifted halfway through the page. "They fined you for snow they put there." Yep, the audacity of it was almost impressive. The notice included a neat little diagram showing proper snow storage techniques. Apparently, homeowners were responsible for ensuring snow piles didn't block road access or create hazards for other residents. At the bottom was the part that really made it clear this wasn't just bureaucracy. If the violation is not corrected within 10 days, fines will increase to $1,000 and additional penalties may apply. 10 days? 10 days to remove the same mountain of snow their trucks were adding to every morning. That's when I decided I was done guessing. I grabbed my coat, picked up the letter, and drove straight to the biggest house in Stonefield Manor, Cordelia Ashford's place. Her house sat at the end of a perfectly curved driveway, like something out of a magazine. White columns, massive windows, manicured hedges still peeking through the snow. A white Mercedes sat in the circular drive with a vanity license plate that read Queen Bee. That should have been my first warning. When she opened the door, she looked exactly like someone who would drive a car with that plate. Perfectly styled hair, pearl necklace, cashmere coat. She didn't even bother pretending to smile. "Yes," I held up the letter. "You want to explain why the HOA just fined me for snow? Your trucks dumped on my property." Cordelia glanced at the notice like she already knew exactly what it said. Then she gave a small, polite smile. The kind people learn in expensive finishing schools. "Mr. Kavanaugh," she said calmly, adjusting her pearls. "The HOA has established usage rights for that section of land." I blinked. Usage rights? Yes, that area has been used by the community for over 30 years. Your uncle understood the arrangement. My uncle, Uncle Pete, had owned this property before me. He was the kind of guy who would let neighbors borrow tools and never ask for them back. But something about the way Cordelia said that made me suspicious. "So you're saying the HOA owns part of my property?" "No," she said smoothly, "but we have prescriptive rights due to long-term usage." It was a fancy legal phrase meant to sound intimidating, but there was one small problem. "I'd like to see the paperwork," I said. Her smile flickered. "What paperwork?" "The easement," I replied. "The legal document that says you can use my property." For the first time since opening the door, Cordelia hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. And in that moment, I realized something. They didn't have it. 42 feet. That was the number that changed everything. When the surveyor said it, I actually thought I'd misheard him. "Sorry," I said, looking down at the printed map spread across the hood of his truck. "How much did you say?" He tapped the paper with the tip of his pen. 42 feet of the HOA road is sitting on your property." For a second, neither of us said anything. The wind pushed loose snow across the driveway, and behind us that same disgusting mountain of gray snow still sat in my yard like a frozen landfill. All winter long I'd been told the same thing. The HOA had usage rights. The HOA had historical access. The HOA had community privileges. But the bright red survey lines on that map were brutally simple. The road that connected half the neighborhood to the main street didn't legally belong to the HOA. It belonged to me. The surveyor crouched down beside the property marker he'd just installed, a small metal stake stuck out of the frozen ground with a bright orange flag tied to it. "You see this line?" he said, tracing it across the map. I nodded. "That's your official property boundary, according to county records." His pen moved another few inches acro. "It's the paper and this," he said, tapping the gray rectangle that represented the HOA street, crosses over it by 42 feet. I stared at it. For 36 years, that road had been treated like it belonged to the neighborhood. Kids rode bikes on it. Mail trucks drove across it. Snowplows cleared it every winter, and apparently they dumped the snow on my land afterward. "Is there an easement?" I asked. The surveyor shook his head. "Not that I can find. I checked county records twice before coming out here. No recorded access agreement. Nope. No shared use contract. Nothing." I leaned against my truck, trying to process what that meant. For decades, the HOA had been acting like they owned something that legally they didn't. And Cordelia had looked me straight in the eye and told me they had rights to the land. "Could they claim adverse possession?" I asked. The surveyor shrugged. "They could try, but that's a long process and usually requires uncontested use for years without objection." He gestured toward the huge snow pile still sitting on my property. "Based on the situation you've described, I'd say the contesting part already started." I couldn't help smiling at that. The surveyor packed up his equipment while I took pictures of the markers from every angle. If this turned into a legal fight, I wanted everything documented. But the real shock came later that evening, because I made a mistake. I told a neighbor. Tom lived 2 houses down, retired electrician, friendly guy, always shoveling his driveway before sunrise. He was walking his dog when he saw the survey flags. "What's with the construction markers?" he asked. I held up the survey map. "Turns out the HOA road cuts across my property by 42 feet. Tom laughed at first. Then he realized I wasn't joking. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." I showed him the map. He stared at it for a long time. Then he said something that made the situation 10 times bigger. "Wait a second. If that road's on your property," he pointed down the street, "then what the hell have we been paying road maintenance fees for?" That question spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. Faster than wildfire. Within 24 hours, half the block had seen the survey photos. People started checking their HOA statements. Every homeowner had been paying annual fees for road maintenance, snow removal, repaving funds, storm drainage repairs, all for a road the HOA didn't even legally control. The next evening I stepped outside and found 3 neighbors standing near the property markers, staring at the bright orange flags sticking out of the snow. One of them shook his head. "So let me get this straight," he said. "We've been paying thousands of dollars over the years," he pointed at the road, "for something that isn't even ours." Another neighbor looked at the massive snow pile still sitting in my yard. "And they fined you for this?" I nodded. For the first time since the snow dumping started, people were getting angry. Not at me, at the HOA. And somewhere inside her massive White House at the end of the street, Cordelia Ashford had no idea that the tiny orange flags sticking out of the snow were about to start a war she couldn't win. Cordelia Ashford didn't like being questioned, and the moment the survey started spreading through the neighborhood, she made one thing very clear. She wasn't going to back down. 3 days after the orange property flags appeared, every homeowner in Stonefield Manor received an email marked "Mandatory Home Meeting. Attendance required." The timing wasn't a coincidence. Everyone already knew about the survey by then. Neighbors had been talking. Photos of the property lines had been shared in the community group chat. People were asking uncomfortable questions about road fees and maintenance funds, and Cordelia was losing control of the narrative. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday night in the small clubhouse near the entrance of the neighborhood. By the time I arrived, the parking lot was already packed. That alone was unusual. HOA meetings usually had 5 people at most, mostly retirees arguing about mailbox paint colors. But this time, the room was full. 30, maybe 40 homeowners. People stood along the walls, holding printed copies of the survey map. Others sat with folded arms, whispering to each other. The atmosphere felt less like a meeting and more like a courtroom. At exactly 7 p.m., the door behind the front table opened. Cordelia walked in. Perfect posture. Perfect hair. Perfectly composed. She wore a dark blazer and carried a leather binder like a CEO about to fire half the company. Behind her sat 2 other HOA board members who looked noticeably less confident. Cordelia didn't smile. She didn't greet anyone. She simply placed the binder on the table and looked around the room. I understand there has been some confusion regarding property boundaries. She began calmly. A few people shifted in their seats. Then she glanced at me. Not subtly, directly. And unfortunately, she continued, certain individuals have been spreading misleading information that could create unnecessary panic within the community. A few heads turned toward me, but before she could continue, Tom, the retired electrician, raised his hand. "Is it misleading?" he asked. Cordelia paused. "What exactly do you mean?" Tom held up the survey printout. "This says the HOA road is 42 feet onto his property." He pointed toward me. "Is that true or not?" For the first time that night, Cordelia's calm expression tightened slightly. She clasped her hands together on the table. "The road has been used by this community for over 3 decades, she said carefully. "That wasn't the question," Tom replied. The room got quiet. Cordelia inhaled slowly. "As I was saying," she continued, "long-term usage establishes legal precedent. Someone from the back spoke up. Do you have paperwork?" More murmurs spread through the room. Another neighbor raised his voice. "Yeah, where's the easement?" Cordelia's jaw tightened. "The HOA's legal counsel is currently reviewing the matter." That wasn't an answer, and everyone in the room knew it. Then she flipped open the binder in front of her and said something that completely changed the tone of the meeting. "In the meantime," she announced, "the board has voted to pursue adverse possession of the disputed property." For a moment, people looked confused. Then someone asked, "What does that mean?" Cordelia leaned back slightly in her chair. "It means the community will begin the legal process of establishing ownership over that portion of land due to long-term usage." A few people blinked. Then Tom said what everyone was thinking. "So you're trying to take his property?" "It's not his property if the court determines otherwise," Cordelia replied smoothly. That was the moment the room exploded. Voices rose instantly. "You're suing a homeowner? You're using HOA money for that? Are you serious right now?" Cordelia raised her hand sharply. "Please maintain order." But the calm she'd walked in with was gone, because dozens of homeowners were suddenly realizing something. If the HOA was going to court, then the survey might actually be right. And if the survey was right, then they'd been paying thousands of dollars in HOA fees for a road that wasn't even legally theirs. I stood up. That immediately got everyone's attention. "Can I ask something?" I said. Cordelia looked annoyed, but nodded. "Go ahead." I held up my phone. Before coming here tonight, I checked county property records again. The room went quiet. There is no easement for the road, no recorded agreement, no shared access permit, nothing. Just the HOA claiming rights because they've been using it for years. "So you're telling everyone here," I continued, "that instead of fixing the mistake," I gestured toward the road outside, "you're planning to spend HOA money trying to take my land?" Cordelia's expression hardened. "If necessary, yes." That answer landed like a grenade. One woman near the front leaned forward. "Wait, HOA money means our money. Another man shook his head. You're starting a lawsuit against a neighbor using our dues. Cordelia closed the binder sharply. The board will decide what actions are appropriate. But by then, the damage was done, because the room wasn't quiet anymore. People weren't whispering. They were angry, really angry. And the biggest mistake Cordelia made that night wasn't threatening the lawsuit. It was doing it in front of 40 witnesses. Because every single person in that room walked out of the clubhouse that night with the same realization. This wasn't about Snow anymore. This was about a power-hungry HOA president trying to steal a homeowner's land. And once that story started spreading beyond the neighborhood, Cordelia Ashford's problems were about to get much, much worse. $38,000. That was the number that made my jaw drop. And it was buried in a boring spreadsheet that Cordelia probably never expected anyone outside the HOA board to look at. The discovery didn't happen all at once. It started with something small, almost insignificant, a receipt. 2 days after the explosive HOA meeting, my neighbor Tom knocked on my door holding a thick stack of printed papers. You might want to see this, he said. Tom had spent 30 years as an electrician, which meant he had one useful personality trait. He hated when numbers didn't add up. After the meeting, he had gone home and started digging through the HOA financial reports posted on the community portal. Technically, every homeowner had access to them, but nobody ever looked, because they were boring. Pages and pages of expenses, maintenance records, landscaping invoices, snow removal bills, and budget summaries. The kind of documents most people scroll past without reading, except Tom actually read them. Look at this line, he said, spreading the papers across my kitchen table. I leaned over. Winter maintenance contract, he said. Snow removal and road clearing, $18,600 annually. That didn't seem unusual at first. Snow plowing a neighborhood every winter wasn't cheap, but Tom tapped the next column. See who the contractor is. I read the company name printed on the invoice. Ashford Community Services, LLC. My brain took a second to connect the dots. Ashford, I said slowly. Yeah, Tom replied, as in Cordelia Ashford. My stomach tightened. You're telling me the HOA hired a company with their name on it? Tom flipped another page. Not just hired. He pointed at the total column. They've been paying this company for years. I scanned down the records. 2018, $17,900. 2019, $18,200. 2220. $18,500 2021. $18,600 2022. $19,100 thousands of dollars every single year. Paid by the HOA. For snow removal, my eyes slowly moved from the paper to the massive frozen mountain of snow still sitting in my yard outside the window. You've got to be kidding me, I muttered. Tom nodded grimly. That's not the best part. He pulled out another document. This one showed additional charges. ROA. D-maintenance inspection. Salt application. Emergency snow relocation. Each one billed separately. Each one charged by the same company. Ashford Community Services. I did the math in my head. That's over $30,000, I said. Tom corrected me. $38,000, actually. $38,000 paid to a company owned by the HOA president for maintaining a road that, according to the survey, wasn't even legally the HOA's to maintain. We sat there in silence for a moment, because the implication was obvious. Cordelia hadn't just been running the HOA. She had been paying herself with the HOA funds. And if the road technically crossed my property, then those maintenance charges were for work done on land the HOA didn't legally control. That's bad, I said. Tom gave a short laugh. That's fraud if someone decides to look closely. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Outside, the late afternoon sun reflected off the frozen snow pile, turning the dirty ice into a blinding white glare. For weeks that pile had just been an annoyance, a symbol of the HOA pushing me around. But now it looked different, because that snow wasn't just dumped there out of laziness. It was part of a system. The HOA paid Cordelia's company to clear the roads. Cordelia's trucks dumped the excess snow on my property. Then the HOA fined me for the pile. And the HOA, meaning the homeowners, paid Cordelia's company again to manage the situation. It was a perfect little loop. Money went out of HOA accounts and straight back into a business. "Does anyone else know about this?" I asked. Tom shook his head. "Not yet." He leaned back in his chair. "But they will." And he was right. Because once homeowners started seeing those financial reports, the snow dispute stopped being a neighborhood argument. It became something much bigger. Within 48 hours, copies of the HOA financial statements were circulating through the neighborhood email group. People who had barely spoken during the meeting were suddenly asking questions. A lot of questions. How long has this company been billing us? Why didn't anyone disclose that the president owns it? Are we paying HOA dues so she can pay herself? The tone of the messages changed quickly. Confusion turned into anger, and anger turned into outrage, because homeowners weren't just upset about the road anymore. They were starting to realize something far worse. The person who had been threatening lawsuits, issuing fines, and claiming authority over everyone's property might have been using the HOA as her personal paycheck. And the more people looked at those numbers, the clearer the picture became. Cordelia Ashford hadn't just started a fight with one homeowner. She had just accidentally exposed years of financial misconduct, and the next move she made was going to make the situation explode. The idea that ended the entire HOA's power started as a joke. It was Tom who said it first. We were standing in my driveway early one Saturday morning, staring at the disgusting grey mountain of snow that had been dumped on my property for weeks. The pile had hardened into a massive block of ice, layered with road salt, gravel, and chunks of frozen sludge scraped from every street in the neighborhood. At this point, it was taller than my truck. Tom kicked the side of it with his boot. "You!" he said casually. "That thing's practically a wall already." I laughed at first. Then I stopped laughing, because the moment the idea hit my brain, it refused to leave. A wall! The survey stakes were still sticking out of the ground with bright orange flags marking the property line. That line cut directly across the HOA road, 40 feet of it, and according to county records, that land was mine. Which meant something very important. Anything built on my side of that line was completely legal. I looked back at the frozen snow pile. "You ever operate heavy equipment?" I asked. Tom raised an eyebrow. "Why?" I didn't answer. Instead, I walked back into my garage and pulled out a set of old construction gloves. Because here's the thing, most HOAs forget when they start pushing people around. Some homeowners don't just own houses. Some of us own equipment. By noon that same day, 3 trucks were parked in my driveway. A front loader, a compact bulldozer, and a small excavator I borrowed from a buddy who runs a landscaping company. The moment the machines arrived, neighbors started gathering. First a couple people, then 10, then almost the entire block. Because everyone had heard about the HOA meeting, everyone had seen the financial reports circulating, and everyone had noticed something strange that morning. For the first time all winter, the HOA snowplows hadn't come down the street. Probably because someone on the board finally realized that continuing to dump snow on my property while the entire neighborhood was watching might not be a great idea. But they were already too late. I climbed into the front loader and started the engine. The machine roared to life, diesel fumes puffing into the cold air. Tom stood off to the side with his arms crossed. "You're really doing this?" he asked. I grinned. Oh yeah. The metal bucket slammed into the side of the snow pile with a deep crunch. What had once been loose snow was now a solid frozen mass. The bucket carved out huge blocks of compacted ice and pushed them toward the property line. People started pulling out their phones. Someone laughed. Holy crap, he's actually building something. And that's exactly, hat I was doing. For the next 4 hours, the machines worked non-stop. The excavator cut large slabs out of the frozen mound. The bulldozer pushed them into position. The loader packed more snow and ice on top. Layer by layer, the pile transformed, not into a mound, into a structure. A long, thick barrier running exactly along the bright orange property markers. Every few minutes, someone from the crowd would walk over and check the survey map to make sure we stayed inside the legal boundary. 2 feet left, someone called. Perfect, Tom said. Keep it right there. By late afternoon, the shape was unmistakable. A wall, 12 feet high, nearly 40 feet long. Solid ice and packed snow reinforced by the freezing temperature. And most importantly, positioned entirely on my property, which meant there was nothing the HOA could legally do about it. As the sun started dropping behind the houses, I shut off the loader and climbed down. The street was silent, because everyone was staring at the same thing. The HOA road, completely blocked. The massive frozen wall cut directly across the pavement like something out of a disaster movie. No car could drive through it. No truck could push through it. Even a plow blade would struggle to break something that thick. Tom walked up beside me and looked at the barrier. Well, he said slowly, that's one way to handle it. I brushed the snow off my gloves and nodded toward the road. Technically, the HOA still has access. He raised an eyebrow. How? I pointed down the street toward the main entrance of the neighborhood. They can drive all the way around the other side. Tom thought about that. That's an extra mile. Yup, and the garbage trucks. They'll figure it out. People in the crowd started laughing. Someone clapped. Another neighbor shook his head in disbelief. Cordelia is going to lose her mind when she sees this. And he was right. Because early the next morning, when the first HOA board members drove down the street and saw the frozen barrier blocking their precious road, the meltdown that followed could probably be heard 3 neighborhoods away. But the real chaos was only just beginning. At exactly 7:12 a.m., Cordelia Ashford's scream echoed across Stonefield Manor, and I mean echoed. Because when she turned the corner in her white Mercedes and saw a 12-foot wall of solid ice blocking the neighborhood road, she slammed the brakes so hard the car skidded sideways. Her door flew open. What the hell is this? I was already standing outside with a mug of coffee. The morning air was freezing, but the sky was bright and clear. Overnight, the temperature had dropped low enough to turn the entire structure into something closer to concrete than snow. The wall wasn't going anywhere. Neighbors were already gathering again. Drawn by the sound of Cordelia's voice, she stormed toward me, heels crunching on the icy pavement. "You cannot do this," she shouted, pointing at the barrier. "You've blocked a community roadway." I calmly sipped my coffee. "No," I said. "I improved my property." Her face turned bright red. "That road belongs to the HOA." "Really?" I said. Then I pointed at the survey markers. Because, according to the county survey, the road crosses 42 feet of my land. Several neighbors behind her started whispering. Cordelia turned to the wall again, clearly trying to process the reality in front of her. Garbage trucks couldn't pass. Delivery vans couldn't pass. School buses couldn't pass. School buses couldn't pass. 200 homes suddenly had a 12-foot frozen problem sitting in the middle of their street. "You need to remove this immediately," she snapped. I shook my head. "I can't." "Why not?" "Safety reasons." Her eye twitched. "What safety reasons?" "Well," I said casually, "if I tear it down now, all that snow will collapse into the street." Someone in the crowd laughed. Another neighbor muttered, "He's not wrong." Cordelia spun toward the crowd. "This is illegal." That's when another voice spoke up. Actually, 3 voices. Is it? Everyone turned. Tom was standing there with Janet and 2 other homeowners, and they were holding something. Printouts. The HOA financial statements. Tom raised the papers. Cordelia, he said calmly, maybe we should talk about why the HOA has been paying Ashford Community Services nearly $40,000 for road maintenance. Her expression froze. The crowd got very quiet. Janet stepped forward. You forgot to mention something at the HOA meeting, she said. You own that company. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Cordelia's mouth opened, closed, opened again. That is completely irrelevant, is it? Tom interrupted. He held up another page. Because it looks like you've been billing the HOA for roadwork on land the HOA doesn't legally own. Now the whispers got louder. Someone behind me said, Wait, so we've been paying her. Another voice followed. For years? Cordelia looked like someone had just pulled the ground out from under her. This is slander, she snapped. But the damage was already done. Phones were out. People were reading the documents, and once homeowners started realizing their HOA dues might have been funding Cordelia's private company, the entire mood shifted. Suddenly the wall wasn't the problem. Cordelia was. She turned back to me, furious. You planned this. I shrugged. No, I said. You dumped 3 weeks of snow on my property. I gestured toward the massive frozen barrier. I just returned the favor. The police showed up 20 minutes later. Apparently someone had called about a road obstruction. The officer stepped out of the cruiser and stared at the wall. Then he looked at the survey documents Tom handed him. Then he looked at Cordelia. Ma'am, he said carefully, do you have documentation proving the HOA owns this land? Cordelia tried to speak. Nothing came out. The officer nodded slowly. Well then, he said, glancing back at the wall, this appears to be a private property issue, which meant there was nothing he could do. The road stayed blocked for 6 hours. 6 very uncomfortable hours. Garbage trucks had to turn around. Parents had to park down the street. Delivery drivers refused to enter the neighborhood. And by early afternoon, the HOA board finally called an emergency meeting. Not to punish me, to negotiate. Because suddenly the situation was very simple. The HOA had 2 choices: spend tens of thousands of dollars building a new road around my property, or finally admit they needed permission to use it. By sunset that evening, Cordelia Ashford officially resigned as HOA president. Her company's contracts with the HOA were terminated, and the board signed a legal agreement granting them a proper easement across my land. With conditions: no dumping snow, no fines, and a yearly payment for road access. A week later, the wall came down. But the story didn't, because someone had filmed the entire thing. The argument, the wall, the financial records, Cordelia's meltdown. Within days, the video had spread across the internet. Millions of views, thousands of comments from people sharing their own HO horror stories. And every time I drive down that road now, I still smile a little, because under that pavement, right beneath 42 feet of asphalt, is the piece of land that reminds an entire neighborhood of one simple rule: never start a war with someone who owns the ground you're standing on.